true pioneer in the music world is gone. For a generation of Americans, Saturday morning meant the breakthrough show called Soul Train. Today we learn the show's creator, Don Cornelius.
No television program shaped music, dance, and style quite like Soul Train. For decades, it wasn't just a show, it was a movement, a Saturday ritual that electrified living rooms across America. But toward its final years, something began to shift.
We wanted to take a moment to note the passing of Don Cornelius, the creator of Soul Train. He died today in Los Angeles at 75, and apparently Bill Whitaker tells us that Cornelius was a TV pioneer with a vision.
Whispers of tension, creative clashes, and behind-the-scenes drama started to swirl. Then, without warning, the music stopped. What could bring such an iconic institution to an abrupt and silent halt? And why do some still speak of its final days in hushed tones? The answers are far from ordinary. The day the music stopped. March 2006 began like countless other production weeks in Soul Train's long history. On paper, this was to be just another taping, another chance to capture the music, movement, and magic that had carried the show for more than 3 decades. The location was familiar, Los Angeles, the city that had hosted the program since the 1970s. But almost from the moment the crew began to gather, something felt off. The production team had been shuffled at the last minute, replacing seasoned staff with newer hires unfamiliar with the show's long-established rhythm. Lighting setups lagged behind schedule. Sound checks ran late. Even the guest list, normally locked down well before taping day, seemed in flux. Some names had been added and then abruptly dropped. Others were confirmed only hours before call time. For a show once known for its precise execution, the disorganization was glaring. Amid the chaos, word began to spread that Don Cornelius himself was on the premises. Though he had stepped away from active production years earlier, his shadow still loomed over Soul Train. He had built it from the ground up, and while he no longer ran the day-to-day operations, the show's DNA was still unmistakably his. Crew members spotted him backstage, observing quietly at first, arms crossed, his signature composed demeanor intact. But as rehearsals dragged on and technical snags piled up, that composure thinned. Those close enough swore they saw him shake his head, muttering under his breath about how far things had slipped. The featured act for the episode was a rising hip-hop artist, someone poised for a mainstream breakthrough. For Soul Train, this booking was already a departure. The show had long walked a careful line between staying current and maintaining the classy, stylish tone Cornelius had insisted upon since day one. The moment the performance got underway, it was clear that a line had been crossed. The dancers donned costumes that left hardly anything to the imagination and were all the more shocking for Soul Train audiences. Instead, choreography went beyond all conceivable limits through suggestive movements and an aggressive kind of staging. Visual backdrops flashed with imagery more suitable to a late-night dive than a Saturday afternoon scheduled network show. This was something else altogether, not the glitzy and classy tour de force for black music and style on which Soul Train had so proudly built its reputation. From his vantage point, Cornelius reportedly stiffened. Some crew members recall him leaning toward a producer and saying, "This isn't the show I made." Others describe a standoff near the wings, where he seemed to demand an explanation for why this performance was allowed to proceed untouched. His disapproval was not exactly subtle, it was evident in his face, every terse nod and every clipped comment. Although the audience in the studio cheered and danced along, things felt tense behind those cameras. Veteran staff exchanged glances that said more than words could. A few even stepped out into the hallway, sensing the situation was heading towards something bigger than just a rough taping day. No one could have guessed it in that moment, but this wasn't merely an episode struggling through production hiccups. This was the taping that would never be broadcast, the recording that would quietly seal Soul Train's fate. In the control room, tension built with each camera angle and cutaway. Directors whispered in headsets, gauging whether to pull the performance up mid-song or ultimately let it play out. Every decision suddenly felt heavier than it usually did, as if the room somehow knew they were setting foot on ground the show had never dared before. Applause filled the studio, but by the time the last note hung in the air, it rang strangely hollow to those working behind the scenes. The audience filed out, and the crew's voices became hushed. No celebratory rap, no sharing of laughter over the best moments. Just that quiet, uneasy shuffle as equipment was packed away. It was almost as if some staff members had decided to evade contact altogether, as though acknowledging what they had just witnessed. The episode was logged and stored like any other, but for those present, something about it felt unairable. They didn't know why yet. They only knew the air had shifted, and it wasn't going back. No one knew it then, but this wasn't just an episode in trouble. It was the episode that would never air Don Cornelius, the vision and the rules. Long before Soul Train became a national phenomenon, Don Cornelius was just another working man in Chicago, directing traffic in a crisp uniform on the South Side. It was the 1960s, an America still deeply segregated, where the idea of a black man building and hosting his own nationally syndicated television program was almost unthinkable. Yet Cornelius was not the kind of man to be bound by the limits of the era. His voice was deep and deliberate, his presence commanding without ever being loud. After enrolling in a short broadcasting course in 1966, he quickly transitioned into television news at WCIU, a local Chicago station. It was there, while covering community stories and events, that he saw the gap. Television rarely, if ever, showcased black music, black dancers, or black culture in a way that was authentic and celebratory. Cornelius envisioned something that didn't just entertain, but affirmed identity. Soul Train, which premiered in 1970, would be that stage. It started as a local Chicago show, but its energy, style, and unapologetic blackness made it impossible to contain. By October 1971, it was airing nationwide. From the start, Cornelius wasn't simply a host, he was the architect. Every aspect of the show, from the lighting to the pace of the Soul Train line, bore his stamp. He had strong ideas about how the culture should be presented to the world. Dancers could be stylish, flamboyant, and daring, but not crude. Costumes could be bold, but never tacky. The moves could be innovative, but they had to stay within a framework he felt maintained dignity. As several former dancers later recalled, Cornelius would personally intervene if he felt a look or routine crossed the line. He saw Soul Train not just as a dance show, but as a cultural ambassador, a place where black music and style could be broadcast into living rooms across America without being distorted by stereotypes. But with such control came friction. Cornelius wasn't interested in chasing every new trend just to keep ratings up, especially when those trends conflicted with his vision. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, hip-hop was on the rise, reshaping the music landscape. Yet Cornelius often viewed it with skepticism. He admired its creativity, but disliked its association with explicit language, violent imagery, and themes he felt reinforced negative perceptions of the black community. While other platforms like Yo! MTV Raps and BET's Rap City embraced hip-hop fully, Cornelius kept it at arm's length, allowing only select artists on the Soul Train stage. The choice preserved the show's polished image, but it also distanced it from younger viewers who wanted the raw, unfiltered energy of the new era. For them, Soul Train began to feel out of step, a relic from an earlier time when its carefully curated performances reflected a different set of values. Ratings began to slide. The industry was changing faster than Cornelius was willing to adapt. Yet, for Cornelius, the show's purpose was never about bending to the times. It was about holding the line, maintaining a standard. And for decades, he did just that, even when it meant swimming against the current. But preserving a vision came at a cost, and soon, the cultural tide would turn against him. The hip-hop rift. By the late 1980s, a new sound was taking over radios, street corners, and clubs across America. Hip-hop wasn't just music. It was a cultural movement with its own fashion, language, and attitude. And television quickly caught on. Yo, MTV Raps launched in 1988, and BET's Rap City, debuting in 1989, became essential viewing for fans. These shows didn't just welcome rap artists, they built entire episodes around them, giving space to the raw energy and unapologetic style that defined the genre's rise. But while rap stars like LL Cool J, Run DMC, and Salt-N-Pepa were becoming household names through these platforms, Soul Train remained selective, sometimes deliberately so. Don Cornelius allowed certain hip-hop acts to perform, but his booking choices leaned toward artists with a more polished or crossover appeal. The harder-edged voices of the movement, from NWA to Public Enemy, were rarely, if ever, invited to the stage. Cornelius didn't hide his reservations. In a 1992 interview, he stated bluntly that much of hip-hop's lyrical content projected negative imagery about the black community. He feared that airing such performances on Soul Train would tarnish the show's identity, which had always been rooted in dignity, positivity, and a celebration of black excellence. These comments drew sharp criticism from artists, producers, and younger fans, many of whom accused Cornelius of being out of touch with the realities and creative pulse of the new generation. Behind the scenes, the divide was growing clearer. The younger dancers on the show wanted to incorporate the latest street styles into their routines, reflecting the trends that dominated clubs and block parties. But Cornelius's team often reined them in, editing choreography or adjusting wardrobe to maintain a family-friendly image. While Yo MTV Raps embraced baggy jeans, gold chains, and aggressive beats, Soul Train still preferred tailored jackets, smooth funk grooves, and disco-inspired lighting. The impact on ratings was inevitable. And Soul Train was the soul of the 60s, with millions tuned in every weekend throughout the 80s. But somewhere in the mid-90s, the young audience, the very demographic that supported the show, were tuning out to contemporary sources. In a sense, as hip-hop began to assert its dominance in the mainstream culture, the ratings dipped even lower. Cornelius felt that in order to survive, he must alter the show in some way, yet keep its identity. In 1993, he left hosting duties, and the show was handed down to relatively new faces like Maestro Clark, Shamar Moore, and eventually Dorian Gregory. The producers took out the sets and replaced them, experimented with sleeker graphics, and appeared to be booking more hip-hop acts. But it appeared all too cosmetic, and these changes were incapable of bridging the expanding cultural gulf. These were two incompatible styles. The essence of Soul Train was poised, subtle, and graceful, the antithesis of everything that represented the raw improvisation of hip-hop. In the early 21st century, Soul Train was a hollow shell of its former self in terms of cultural significance. Ratings once settling in the area of a 5.0 had dropped below a 2.0. Fewer and fewer stations were willing to carry Soul Train in prime weekend slots, opting for shows more suited to the sensibilities of the young and fast-paced. The energy that had once made Soul Train unmissable was fading, and yet no one inside the production could have imagined that the real breaking point was still to come. The friction over hip-hop's place on Soul Train had already chipped away at its relevance, but what no one realized was how fragile the show had become. Years of slow decline, creative tug-of-war, and a widening disconnect with the next generation had left it vulnerable. All it would take was one chaotic moment, a single taping that went too far, to push the program past the point of recovery. That moment arrived in 2006, and it would change Soul Train forever. And yet, none of these struggles could prepare Soul Train for the explosive clash of 2006, the cursed episode. The taping that would become Soul Train's most infamous and final session began under a cloud of tension. Scheduled for March 2006 in Los Angeles, it should have been routine, the kind of production day the crew could execute in their sleep after decades of experience. But from the first call time, nothing went according to plan. The featured act was a young hip-hop artist on the verge of breaking big, someone whose team knew the importance of exposure and wanted to maximize every moment. Yet, instead of moving with the efficiency that Soul Train had been known for, preparations bogged down in heated back and forths. The artist's representatives and the production staff clashed over staging, lighting, and even camera angles. Demands for last-minute changes slowed the process to a crawl. By the time all parties agreed, they were already running nearly an hour behind schedule. When the performance finally began, it was immediately clear that this was not going to be a standard Soul Train moment. The costumes were bold to the point of being confrontational, cut in ways that left little to the imagination. The choreography leaned heavily on provocative moves, blurring the line between playful flirtation and something far more suggestive. The visual backdrops and props pulsed with imagery more suited to a late-night club scene than an afternoon television broadcast that families could watch together. For those who had worked on the show for years, the shift was jarring. This was not the elegant, stylish Soul Train that Don Cornelius had once described as a cultural ambassador. It was a clear departure from the brand's long-standing visual and moral boundaries. Backstage, tension reached a breaking point. Don Cornelius, who had been present that day despite no longer running production, reportedly stepped forward to intervene. Multiple accounts suggest he ordered the filming to stop, insisting the footage could not be allowed to air in its current form. The move triggered immediate crisis talks. Cornelius called for an emergency meeting with senior production staff and distribution partners. Tribune Entertainment, a major distributor for the show, was not pleased. Sources say the company had already been uneasy about the show's declining ratings and shifting content. This incident was the final straw. Within days of the taping, Tribune officially withdrew from distributing Soul Train. The loss of Tribune set off a chain reaction. Without a reliable distributor, the show's network presence crumbled. Affiliates that had carried Soul Train for years began quietly pulling it from their schedules. Longtime time slots were filled with newer, trendier programming. No public statement was made. There was no grand farewell, no on-air acknowledgement, just silence. To the public, Soul Train seemed to vanish overnight. But for those inside the production, the connection was obvious. The final episode had crossed a line, both in content and in trust, that could not be repaired. For years after, the footage from that day became the stuff of rumor and myth. Some insiders claimed copies still existed in private archives, quietly guarded by former staff. Others insisted the tapes had been locked away indefinitely due to legal complications and damage to the show's brand. Fans speculated endlessly online, dubbing it the cursed episode, a title that only deepened its mystique. What was certain was this: the taping didn't just end a production day. It severed the final thread holding Soul Train to the airwaves, leaving only unanswered questions in its place. Within 3 weeks, local stations were gone, and Soul Train vanished without an official goodbye. Silence and speculation. When the cameras stopped rolling that March day in 2006, there was no official statement, no urgent press release, and certainly no farewell to the millions who had tuned in over the decades. Instead, Soul Train simply stopped appearing. The time slot that once carried its colorful sets, iconic dance lines, and celebrity performances was quietly filled with other programming. On the official Soul Train website, updates froze in place, as if someone had just walked away from the keyboard and never returned. The absence was deafening. Loyal viewers wrote to stations asking why the show had disappeared, but answers were scarce. Some affiliates claimed they were simply restructuring their weekend lineup. Others dodged the question entirely. What the public didn't know was that there had been no formal cancellation because there had been no final decision announced, at least not in any official capacity. Internally, the 2006 taping had become a fault line too wide to bridge. As the weeks turned into months, whispers began to surface from behind the scenes. A few former staffers, speaking on condition of anonymity, referred to the unaired episode as the cursed performance. The phrase wasn't meant literally. No one believed the tape was haunted, but it carried the weight of the unease that had settled over everyone who had been there. According to these insiders, the tension on set that day was unlike anything they had experienced in years of production. The conflict between the performance's content and the Soul Train tradition had left a lingering discomfort that no amount of editing could fix. Fans, deprived of official information, filled in the silence themselves. On internet forums, social media pages, and fan blogs, theories began to multiply. Some insisted the episode had been buried to protect the Soul Train brand from embarrassment. Others believed it was a matter of censorship, that Cornelius or the show's distributors had deemed the content too risque or too off-brand for broadcast. A smaller but vocal group argued that the end was purely financial, a decision driven by corporate maneuvering after Tribune Entertainment's sudden departure. Without any definitive explanation, the cursed episode became something of a pop culture ghost story. Clips were rumored to exist in private collections, passed around quietly among former crew and insiders, but none ever leaked in full, just deepened the mystery in the final act of the show. It turned out to be a saga-come legend about the day Soul Train danced before its last curtain call, instead of what might have been a straightforward case of dwindling ratings. For viewers who had supported the show for long, this was more than just the disappearance of a TV show. It resonated like an event marking the quick disappearance of a cultural anchor. Those Saturday afternoons no longer had that same pulse of music and movement. For many, it all felt like a part of their own history had quietly been erased. The more elusive it became, the more the story of the cursed episode transformed into something bigger than a missing broadcast. It became a metaphor for unrecorded questions, the kind that nibbles away at memory and transforms nostalgia into obsession. For Don Cornelius, who had built it all, those questions had a weight that most would never understand. In the end, the absence of answers was almost as impactful as the disappearance of the show itself. Each passing year without clarification turned the cursed episode into a locked vault, one that only a handful of people had ever seen inside. It wasn't just about what had happened on stage that day, but about what it represented: the unraveling of trust, the closing of an era, and the weight of choices made in private rooms far from the cameras. For the public, the mystery remained an open wound. For Don Cornelius, it became something he would carry in silence. While the audience searched for answers, Don Cornelius chose a different path, disappearing from public life. Don's quiet exit. In the months after Soul Train's disappearance from the airwaves, Don Cornelius seemed to vanish right along with it. There was no press conference, no tell-all interview, no public explanation for what had happened. For a man who had once been the face and voice of the show, the figure whose calm, deliberate presence had introduced countless performances, the silence was striking. His only public comment came in 2007 during a brief appearance on a local radio program. Asked about the show's abrupt end, Cornelius offered a single cryptic line: "I think it went far enough." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The tone carried a mix of resignation and finality, as though the decision, however it had unfolded, was one he had made peace with, or at least decided not to challenge. Behind the scenes, confusion reigned. Former hosts like Dorian Gregory, who had fronted the program during its final stretch, later admitted that no one had been told outright that Soul Train was over. The filming schedule simply stopped appearing on the production calendar. Crew members and performers found out through whispers, or by seeing the show's Saturday time slot replaced with something else. For many who had devoted years, even decades, to the program, it felt less like an ending and more like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Away from the public eye, Cornelius's personal life grew more complicated. In 2008, he was arrested on charges of domestic violence, though he ultimately avoided jail time. Friends and former colleagues noticed that his appearances at industry events became rare, almost non-existent. The man who had once commanded a stage now seemed to shrink from any spotlight. Those close to him spoke of a deep sense of disappointment, not only with how the show had ended, but with how the legacy he'd spent a lifetime building had been handled in its final years. After news broke in 2012 that Don Cornelius had taken his own life in his Los Angeles home, he was just 75 years old. It was a huge loss, not only for the fans of Soul Train, but for generations upon generations of artists, dancers, and viewers whom he had influenced. Many unanswered questions remain. The 2006 taping, the real reason for the show's disappearance, and the toll those final years took personally on him. Even in death, Cornelius remained an unknowable figure, as private and unspoken as his last act was, the one that took Soul Train off the air. Gradually, in those subsequent years, his name became less associated with than the stark realization it represented. The sudden silence of Soul Train, and more with the raw and enormous legacy it once had. Old archival recordings resurfaced. Documentaries again visited his breathless race against success, and memorial tributes redefined him to both visionary and cautionary tale. For those who really knew him, the mystery of his quiet withdrawal did not derive from a lack of words, but rather where he was choosing not to explain what he felt the world would never be able to understand. Remain the questions, but so does the unmistakable imprint he had left on American culture. Yet, even in absence, Soul Train's legacy refused to fade. The legacy lives on. Though Soul Train left the airwaves in 2006 without fanfare, its cultural heartbeat never stopped. In the years that followed, the show began to re-emerge, not as a weekly broadcast, but as a touchstone in documentaries, dramatizations, and museum exhibitions. BE's scripted series American Soul, which debuted in 2019, introduced a new generation to Don Cornelius's journey, blending fact and dramatization to capture the high stakes of creating a black-centered music show in a white-controlled television industry. While the series didn't depict the infamous final taping, it conveyed the constant push and pull between creative vision and commercial demands, a battle that defined Soul Train from its first days to its last. Beyond television, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture enshrined Soul Train as part of the nation's cultural heritage. Visitors can now stand before display cases holding original costumes worn on the show's stage, bright, tailored, and unapologetically stylish, reminders of the program's role in shaping how Black beauty, fashion, and performance were seen on national TV. These exhibitions cemented what fans had always known. Soul Train was never just a dance show. It was an archive of joy, resistance, and self-expression. Meanwhile, on the internet, Soul Train found a second life. YouTube channels dedicated to classic television began uploading digitized performances from the 1970s and 1980s, drawing millions of views. Some clips were pulled from personal VHS collections. Others came from local stations that once aired the show. For younger audiences who had never experienced the Soul Train line in real time, these videos were a revelation, an unfiltered glimpse into a time when style and soul ruled Saturday afternoons. Social media gave the nostalgia new momentum. The hashtag Soul Train Challenge went viral in 2021 as TikTokers and Instagram users recreated the show's iconic dance line with their own modern flair. Celebrities like Lizzo and Anderson .Paak joined in, posting videos dressed in retro outfits, sliding and spinning their way through homemade Soul Train-style corridors. Party planners began hosting themed nights, complete with 1970s dress codes, funk and R&B playlists, and Soul Train-inspired decor. The aesthetic and energy of the show proved timeless, bridging generations through rhythm and style. This renewed attention also stirred a more scholarly interest. Cultural historians began calling for a full restoration of the show's archives, from the earliest 1971 episodes to the final years that remain mostly untouched. Many believe that preserving Soul Train in its entirety is essential not only for music history, but for documenting Black cultural expression on television. Yet even in these preservation efforts, one chapter remains conspicuously missing: the final, unaired episode of 2006. Industry insiders claim it still exists in private archives, but due to legal complications and content sensitivities, it may never be released to the public. And so, Soul Train continues to exist in two forms: the show we can still watch, share, and celebrate, and the shadow of a finale that remains locked away. Both are part of its story. One sort of event commemorates what was aired. The other signals what wasn't. More than 2 decades since its last broadcast, Soul Train is still influential through music videos, in runway fashions, and even in choreography for large stage productions. Artists in different genres reference Soul Train as a creative foundation in that it stands as proof that a music program could be entertaining and culturally affirming. Its DNA lives in award shows, music festivals, and digital space that intentionally merge performative expression with identity, a model that Cornelius put forth long before it became fashionable. Soul Train's bona fide legacy may not rest on any performance or episode or any given star, but rather in the space it created, one that for over 30 years invited millions to see themselves stylish, talented, and unapologetically here, in realms of media that too often chose to ignore them. Even as its last hurrah remains firmly clouded in mystery, the very heartbeat of the show still resonates, teaching the lesson that representation, once seized, can never be undone. Because sometimes, history remembers what never aired more than what did. If you remember Soul Train, you know it wasn't just a show, it was a cultural heartbeat. Its abrupt, silent end left questions we may never fully answer, but its influence still moves through music, fashion, and dance today. Like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories from the legends of television, and watch the video now on your screen for the next deep dive.